I'm Mike Lamneck. Thank you for joining us here at Music Meanderings. And thank you so much, those of you that have subscribed to the channel. If you haven't, won't you take a second to do so? Please subscribe. It helps out the channel. Hit like and leave a comment. Today we're talking about some of the top albums released by people that left their very popular classic rock band to do a solo album. Now, not all these that I'm going to mention today are first solo albums by these people, although the majority of them are. The one that I start with was not the first solo album for Roger Waters, but it's one I enjoyed immensely. It's called Radio Chaos, K-A-O-S. I actually saw Roger Waters on this tour. It was phenomenal. And I really like the whole theme to the album and the concept behind it. Being a radio DJ myself, I could really relate to the kind of DJ theme and commentary. In fact, during the concert, they even had a radio DJ in a booth as part of the set. Radio waves on this. Who Needs Information? Love that song. Me or Him, The Powers That Be. Also, Sunset Strip, Home, 4 minutes, and The Tide Is Turning, subtitled after Live Aid. And this predictably has a very dark kind of sound to it, as you would expect from a Roger Waters album. Very Pink Floydish, and just a fantastic solo album out of 1987 from Roger Waters, of course, of Pink Floyd fame and Radio Chaos. With this next one, I actually talked about just recently in another video when I was talking about Kiss solo albums, and actually Kiss albums from the 1970s and their entire output of the 1970s. And this one came up as one of my favorites, and that is Ace Frehley's solo album. This is my original cassette. I think it still plays. I'm still looking for a decent vinyl copy of this one. But Ace Frehley and his solo album, the best selling of the 4 Kiss solo albums, and the only one with a big hit off of it that actually still gets played today, and a New York Groove. Back in 1978, the guys were about ready to split as a band, especially Ace Frehley and Peter Criss. They had said they wanted to go on, maybe do a solo record. So management, Bill Aucoin, also Neil Bogart out at Casablanca Records, had an idea. They said, well, go ahead, guys. Don't split up the band. Why don't you just take a year off and do solo records? And that's what they did. It was actually a pretty genius move because it did keep the band together in some form. They did come back and continue on. But Ace Frehley and his 1978 monster debut solo album, still one of my favorites to this day, featuring New York Groove, Rip It Out. So many great songs on this one. Many people were upset, but the band did break up after John Bonham died, and Led Zeppelin fans were kind of left wondering what was going to happen. Were they going to get together with a new drummer? It just wouldn't be the same without Bonham. So, of course, that's when Robert Plant decided to go on his solo career. And this album, now he's got some great solo albums, but to me, this first one, still nothing is measured up to that in my mind, and that is Pictures at 11. Still rocking, very heavy, very Zeppelin-ish, and just a great album. Every song on it here, Burning Down One Side, Moonlight and Samora, Pledge Pin, Slow Dancer, Worst in Detroit, Fat Lip, just great solo album. And I did see him on this tour. Now, interestingly enough, he did not do any Led Zeppelin songs on that tour, which surprised a lot of people, though. The next time around for his next album, though, he did decide to throw in some Zeppelin songs during the tour. Talking about solo albums from folks that, well, they didn't really need to do it. They were in a successful band, but they decided to go off and do a solo record. Anyway, case in point, Lou Gramm of Foreigner and his debut solo album, Ready or Not. Just a great record. If you were a Foreigner fan, you were not disappointed by this album. Very much a Foreigner touch to it. Ready or Not, of course, the big hit that came off of this, Midnight Blue. Also Heartache on there, She's Got to Know, Chain of Love, a very outstanding solo effort by Lou Gramm from the band Foreigner, and Ready or Not, his first solo record. Growing up, I was a big Supertramp fan. Of course, Breakfast in America and a lot of their earlier albums as well. And Roger Hodgson went solo. Actually, Supertramp continued on, but Roger Hodgson did go on solo and released some solo albums. We're talking about Roger Hodgson and The Eye of the Storm. And I think these performers, for the most part, sounded a lot like their bands when they went solo. And this album is very much like that. If you're a Supertramp fan, you're really going to enjoy this album. It doesn't stray too much away from that classic Supertramp sound, but not a bad song on this, and one that might not be on your radar. Some of the other albums I talk about are pretty well known, but this one, not so much. Roger Hodgson and his debut solo album as he broke free from the group Supertramp. Well, we talked about Roger Waters and his solo career. How about David Gilmour? His second solo album I just absolutely love. It's called About Face, and it would pretty much signal the direction or the sound that Pink Floyd would take in the David Gilmour minus Roger Waters years. It reached number 32 on the Billboard 200 chart, number 21 on the UK album chart, released March 5th, 1984, with lots of great songs on it, a couple that got radio airplay, All Lovers Are Deranged and Love on the Air, produced by famed producer Bob Ezrin. And a great album, every song on it. Just a great feel to this record. Solo from Pink Floyd, David Gilmour and About Face. Well, some of these performers that I'm mentioning that went on to do a solo record, it launched them into a solo career. Some of them stayed with the bands that they were in, and some did not. In this next case, this guy decided to forge a career of his own. His songs were very faith-based in nature, and the rest of his band wasn't so crazy about taking that direction. So Kerry Livgren of Kansas, he moved on, and this is his first solo record called Seeds of Change from the Kansas guitarist, sometimes keyboardist. Excellent song called Mask of the Great Deceiver. Got some radio airplay with Ronnie James Dio doing the lead vocals. Also, How Can You Live on this? Ground Zero, Down to the Core, To Live for the King, also featuring Ronnie James Dio, and Robbie Steinhardt, Steve Walsh, and other members of Kansas contributing to this great solo record by Kerry Livgren and Seeds of Change out of 1980. Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. The Stones normally reserved a song, if you got lucky, maybe two songs for Keith on each Stones album, and a lot of times they were my favorites. I always liked Keith Richards and his kind of wry singing style. Well, he released a solo record in 1988 with the title Talk is Cheap, and it was a fantastic record for Keith. And if you liked Keith Richards and his contribution to the Rolling Stones, you were not disappointed with this. Take It So Hard was a radio hit off of that. Big Enough, How I Wish, Rock a While, Whip It Up. It Means a Lot. Just classic Keith Richards Stones sounding record. And he had a band with him that he stayed with and toured with for many years called the Expensive winos and quite a lineup. Waddy Watchtower on guitar, Ivan Neville, Charlie Drayton, and Steve Jordan. You might recognize that name because he was the one to replace Charlie Watts and is currently the Rolling Stones drummer. Well, as time has gone by and we've learned more about the recording process of Boston, we have learned that Boston was pretty much, at least in the studio, a Tom Scholz solo project with some input from Brad Delp. But the other guys were pretty much just relied on to do live performances. And Barry Gaudreau, the second guitarist for Boston, of course, he had an excellent solo album, also had an album with his band, Orion the Hunter, which is a very, very good record as well. And another one that I got to see live in concert was when he teamed up with Brad Delp for 2 RTZ, that stands for Return to Zero albums. Of the two, the first one that was released in 1991 is by far my favorite. And as you might think, with Barry Gaudreau and Brad Delp on it, it is very Boston sounding. Songs like Face to Music, There's Another Side, All You've Got, Every Door is Open, Devil to Pay, Living for the Rock and Roll, and Return to Zero. Just lots of great cuts on that album. If you are a Boston fan, Barry Gaudreau, Brad Delp fan, and you haven't heard this, you want to check it out of 1991, RTZ, Return to Zero. I'm Mike Lamneck. It's Music Meanderings. Why don't you take a quick second to subscribe to the channel, perhaps like the video, or comment. What are some of your favorite solo records from artists that broke away from huge classic rock bands? You know, they take kind of a chance when they do that, some of them. Others, not so much, because they just stick with the band. Perhaps this is what they do in their time off. Donald Fagen, a great solo career, and it might be solo, but it still really sounds like Steely Dan. In fact, if you didn't know better and you listened to Donald Fagen music and Steely Dan music on the same playlist, you'd have a tough time saying what's a Steely Dan song and what's a Donald Fagen song. They just sound the same. But if you're a Steely Dan fan, all the better, right? After the band broke up, you had Donald Fagen in his solo career, but it still sounded like Steely Dan all the way out. And of course, that was prevalent on his first solo release in 1982 with The Nightfly. But my personal favorite was his follow-up to that, which didn't come until 11 years later, Kamakiri. 1993 solo. And again, he teamed up with Walter Becker. I mean, Steely Dan was pretty much Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, so you can say it's a solo record, still sounds pretty much like a Steely Dan album. And the hit Snowbound was on that. Tomorrow's Girls, also released as a single. Trans-Island Skyway, personal favorites of mine. Tea House on the track. I love the song Florida Room. In fact, they got to do some of these songs when they toured as Steely Dan. They would throw in a Donald Fagen selection or two. Well, there you go. Some of my favorite solo albums from performers that broke away from very popular classic rock bands. What are some of yours? Go ahead and comment below. And again, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. God bless, and please subscribe to Music Meanderings.